Wonderful. So, hello everybody. My name is Gwen Verthavid. I'm from the Kingdom of Lockhart, and I'm a member of the LGBTQ community, the chronic illness community, and the mental health community. Today, I'm going to be talking to you about creating accessible and inclusive events, and in particular, how doing a survey on this has informed my understanding of what we can do to help. Now, before I go any further, I want to take a moment to acknowledge the traditional custodians of the land where I am, which is the Ngunnawal and Ngambri people. And I want to pay my respects to them and to their elders, past, present, and emerging. I also extend that respect to all First Peoples of the many, many lands where we play our game, be they Aboriginal or Torres Strait Islander or Maori, or beyond the lands of Lockhart, many, many other peoples. Now, in a moment, I'm going to swap to a PowerPoint because there's a lot to cover here. One of the perpetual challenges of trying to address big, broad topics like accessibility and inclusion is figuring out where the problems are. Typically, to answer this question, we rely on either anecdotal data, what we've seen and heard and experienced, or global data, what we see across mundane society that's been observed by academics or other people interested in these topics. And these are both really good sources of information, but what they don't capture is the trends within our community. And so this project was interested in discovering some of those trends. What is it that lots of people in the SCA are looking for? What makes SCA events accessible, inclusive, and welcoming? What can stewards do? So I'm going to share my screen now and we'll take a look. Across December 2019 and January 2020, I ran an online survey to try and gather some data on these topics. I made it as open as I could, using qualitative questions instead of multiple choice, and language like welcoming and comfortable rather than accessible and inclusive, to make sure I was capturing people who might not think of themselves as needing accessibility or inclusion. By the time I closed the survey, I had 264 responses from 15 kingdoms. And 4 years later, I'm still analyzing the data. There was so much of it. To give you a sense of the breadth of people that we captured, this is what people told me about when I asked them, what factors affect your SCA experience that might not affect other members of your community? So I went through all their answers and I categorized them. And you can see we got people talking about their health, about lifestyle stuff, about identity stuff. Relatively few people mentioning identity things, but you can see that there's a range of possibilities here. And any of you who are clever at mathematics might notice when you look down at the axis below that these bars add up to more than 264. Less than a third of people mentioned just one of these categories. The vast majority of people in this survey were mentioning 2, 3, a couple people mentioned 5 and 6 different categories of thing. All of these categories overlapped with the others to some extent. Every access and inclusion issue has intersectional impact. Now, this survey definitely didn't capture everybody. There was only one person from Drachenwald. There were fairly few responses from the southern US. I excluded under 18s because I didn't want to deal with the consent issues. There weren't many respondents over 65. And of course, the survey predates major COVID impacts. Vaccination, masks, those other kinds of COVID precautions simply weren't on anyone's radar. And virtual and live streamed events like this one had barely been considered. So there's a lot of stuff that is not going to appear in these results. But I believe the survey nevertheless did capture enough data to give us a valuable window onto some of the issues present in our community and some of the solutions worth trying. It also captured way more data than I can feasibly cover in 45 minutes. So what I'm going to do today is give you an overview of some of the most interesting and actionable results. And then I'm just going to point you to the project website where you can get more details. And I'll share that link at the end, along with a link to the project Facebook page where you can contact me. I've set aside about 15 minutes for questions after this presentation. And I'm very, very happy to take questions in conversation at that point. But I'd also like to invite you who are attending this session to leave questions in the chat if you'd like me to take them on notice. And I'll go away and answer them from the project Facebook page. Or if you'd like me to answer them by email, please send me a private message with your email and I'll answer them that way. Particularly if you're interested in getting specific numbers, that's going to be easier for me to go away and check. The three topics I'd like to explore today are: one, what people told us about the accessibility of different activities; two, a brief glimpse at what we heard about the role of community culture; and three, going more in depth, what stewards can do to make their events more accessible and inclusive. So let's start with activities. This wasn't the focus of the survey, but two of the questions we asked were: what SCA activities do you participate in? And are there activities you do more of if they're more accessible to you? And if so, what are they? These were open response, not multiple choice. So people just came up with whatever it is that they thought of. What's interesting is that some people mentioned the same activity for the green question and the red question. So when we cross-reference their responses, we actually get three groups: the ones who are able to participate, the ones who aren't able to participate, and the ones in the middle who are currently doing it, but they'd do more if they could. So these are the clusters of activities people mentioned. And you can see right away that a huge number of people mentioned ANS in one way or another, most of whom were able to do it. And this makes sense because ANS is pretty diverse. I think the main lesson we have from this is don't make it worse. Don't stick your ANS stuff in the inaccessible venues or the inaccessible financial situations. Otherwise, that's going okay. Service as well, you can see that most people interested in service are able to find a way to do it, or at least most of the ones who mentioned it. But let's take a closer look at martial activities and at events. The first thing that struck me when I saw this data for the arts martial was that compared to participation rates across the SCA, we've got a bunch more archery and less armored combat than I'd expect. The second thing I noticed was that in the armored combat cluster, accessibility seems to be a lot more binary. Most people are either in the green group where they can participate, or in the red group where they can't. There's not so many people in the yellow zone. Now, this whole section about participation in activities, it wasn't the point of the survey, so I didn't build in follow-up questions asking people about why. We can get a glimpse at possible reasons by looking at who is in those yellow and red zones. For armored combat, there was a disproportionately high number of LGBTQ folks in the red and yellow zone. And rapier combat had the same, as well as a higher than expected number of people with physical disability or health issues. What's fascinating is that archery had a completely different pattern. The yellow and red zone for archery had an unusually high number of folks with financial and work issues, and an unusually high number of parents. Now, this absolutely isn't conclusive, but it suggests that if you were trying to make these activities more accessible, more inclusive, you want very different strategies. You target culture and attitudes for heavy and rapier, and for archery, you target things like affordability and having a child-safe play area near the archery field. Looking at events, there were enough people who specifically mentioned feasts or camping events rather than events in general to take a similar look at those. And for feasts, 85% of people in the yellow and red zone had allergies or dietary needs. 24% of people in the survey had allergies or dietary needs, so very disproportionate representation here. It's really obvious that that's the group that needs to be addressed. That's the group that I'm missing out. For camping events, 84% of people in the yellow and red zone had some kind of physical disability or illness, which is compared to 46% of folks in the whole survey. Again, that's obviously a group worth targeting interventions for. Now, as I mentioned earlier, this topic, which activities are accessible to who and why, wasn't the point of this survey. I don't have the same depth of data. I didn't ask detailed questions. And it's also very likely that there are local effects that I didn't capture. If this is something that interests you, I highly encourage you to do your own research, and I would be absolutely delighted to chat with you about the practicalities of doing a project like this efficiently, effectively, and ethically, because ethics are definitely a consideration for any kind of project in this space. Moving on, I'd like to take a few minutes to talk about the role of community culture, because even though it wasn't what I was trying to find out about, it absolutely dominated the results. This is a word cloud of every answer to every question in the survey, and you can see that people got mentioned constantly. We asked, what has made you feel more comfortable at SCA activities you've attended? And we got more mentions of social factors, of people, of their behavior, of their attitudes, than of anything else. We asked, what's made you feel uncomfortable at SCA activities you've attended? And again, we got more mentions of social factors than anything else. Respondents told us about their experiences with prejudice, with judgment, with being greeted and welcomed or excluded and ignored. They told us about helpfulness and acceptance and representation and disrespect and bullying and discrimination. They talked about sexual harassment and how their groups handled broken stairs. Our culture and our behavior as a community is hugely important. And I'll freely admit it's beyond me. All day today, we've seen wonderful presentations by fantastic people talking about this difficult, essential work of changing hearts and minds and behavior. It's work that's large scale, long term. It's vital for our community to continue to grow and thrive. But it's not the only work that matters. And when I ran this survey, I was trying to answer a much simpler, more immediate question. What can stewards do with the people we've already got and the culture we've already got? What can stewards do to make their events more welcoming for everyone, more comfortable for everyone? And I did get useful answers to this question. Excluding the social issues, there were 11 topics that came up over and over again. And one of them came up more than all the rest. Information. People with any kind of accessibility or inclusion need are used to navigating barriers. They're used to planning for inconvenient venues, for entertaining their kids, for feeding themselves, for getting there, for bringing a cane along or the walker today, depending on what the site's like. They're used to recruiting help. They're used to skipping events that when the effort involved wouldn't be worth it. But planning for these barriers gets a whole lot harder when you aren't sure which barriers you're going to have to navigate. Having information about the event in advance, about the venue, the menu, the schedule, that makes a huge difference. Without changing anything else about the event, by providing information, you can make it more accessible to everyone. And the good news is, information's free. This is a very low cost, low effort intervention, which can be applied to every event. One of the resources on the project website is a guide to sharing event information with a list of things it's ideal to share at different stages in the event process. And I highly encourage you all to build this into your practice and to encourage others to build it into their practice too. Because as the saying goes, knowledge is power. We can change things just with this. There are 10 other topics that came up frequently in people's responses, and I'm going to go through them one at a time. This is still just an overview, so I do encourage you to visit the website to get a bit more detail, especially if you want the numbers on how many people mentioned these issues and who they were, because I did actually look at which kind of groups tended to mention these different things, and it's an interesting bit of data, and it gives you some sense of what approaches you want to use when you're targeting particular populations. The astute may have noticed this little blue box down at the bottom corner of the screen, and I'm going to put one of those anytime I've got an online resource available. The first issue I'm going to talk about, not the most common or most important, just the one I'm going to talk about first, is physical access. And by this I mean, can people physically get around your site? Stairs, everyone thinks of, right? But you should also think about rough ground and hills. Where are you putting your paths? What sort of obstacles are in the way? And where there are obstacles, whether they're tent ropes or chairs in a feast hall, how much room is there to get between them? Someone using a mobility aid, they're going to need a few feet of clearance to navigate the space. Are you making them take the long way around because they can't actually get through? I've put a guide on the website to evaluating and describing these kind of physical accessibility issues, along with some tips for mitigating a challenging site. Again, information is power here. If someone knows what a site is going to be like, they can plan the aids they use accordingly. Also very important for physical accessibility is the amount of time people are expected to spend standing and walking. Are they going to exhaust themselves just getting around your event, even without participating in activities? Keep in mind that someone with mobility issues might take more time or effort to go the same distance, and someone with fatigue issues might have more need for a chair and more difficulty carrying their own chair around. And this doesn't just apply to people with disabilities or chronic illness. If you've sprained your ankle in a fight, if you've got a little kid tagging along, these same issues are going to affect you then as well. Think about how far people are expected to walk to get between activities, and from activities to the bathrooms, to water, to a shaded place to sit. Are you able to make public seating available at the list field or in court or for other activities where people are hanging around somewhere for a long time? Is there anything you can do at gate or at food service to make some alternatives for standing in a queue for 20 minutes? This sort of distance between places is also mentioned in the accessibility evaluation tool I mentioned earlier. And these two issues are very much a pair, but they were mentioned separately a lot and they were mentioned by different people, which is why I've split them apart. Allergy safe food. This is hugely important. You know, that 85% of people who are missing out on feasts, this is going to be one of the things that they mentioned. Because allergy safe food isn't just the difference between someone going home fed and going home hungry. It's the difference between them going home and going to hospital. Even for people with milder allergies and intolerances, how food is handled and prepared and the ingredients, that's a matter of safety. Somebody wrote in all caps, "It can kill us." We've got to take it seriously. At minimum, provide complete ingredients lists at the point of service. Ideally, provide the menu and ingredient list before the event so people can plan alternatives. You need to be mindful of cross-contamination, and if there's a risk that something is contaminated, you need to be honest about that because people would rather be hungry than sick. To make life easier for cooks and attendees, it helps to just build your menu to meet common dietary needs. Vegetarian, gluten-free, dairy-free. If you're going to serve 2 soups, make one of them vegetarian and dairy-free. Check your menu. If someone ate only the vegetarian dishes, would it be a satisfying meal? Building a menu this way reduces the amount of effort you need to spend making special meals for individuals, and it also integrates everybody better, which has its own advantages. Now, you may not be able to cater for everyone, and that's completely okay. You just need to be upfront about that. Again, provide information and make sure that the people who aren't eating the food you're serving can still sit with their friends. I wouldn't even bother to say that, except that somebody in the survey told me an absolute horror story about being made to eat out on the porch because they were self-catering, which is the most literal example of exclusion I can possibly think of. Including off-board attendees may take a little more planning around how you're going to manage serving, but make the time to do that planning, and then make it clear it's an option. One interesting issue that came up quite a lot was quiet spaces. SCA events can be very demanding, socially, physically, at a sensory level. Having a quiet space to withdraw to can make the difference between someone being able to recover and rejoin the activities or having to go home. A quiet space can be a room or a spare pavilion. It just needs to be a physically comfortable area with a bit of separation from the hustle and bustle, with some sort of indicator so people know that they're allowed to go there and they're supposed to be quiet when they're in the space. I've put a guide to making a good quiet space on the website with an example of some of the signage you might use. Issue number 5 on my list is structured social activities. Many of us spend much of our events just chatting to friends. But what will people do with that time if they don't already have someone to talk to? Structured non-combat activities like dance, bardic circles, classes, and games are all ways to encourage people to interact with strangers and build social connections. In their absence, events are going to exacerbate the difference between those who are already included and those who aren't. The former have a lovely day with their friends, and the latter are left bored and lonely. Stewards actually have the power to change this social dynamic. There's something you can do here to help people feel part of the group. Now, where the previous issue was all about what we bring to a venue, ease of travel is to a certain extent built into your venue choice. How are people going to get to your event if they don't have a car? Particularly folks with disabilities, folks who are poor, folks who are old, folks who are young. This comes up. If someone does have a car, how far are they going to have to walk from parking? And are they going to have to carry all of their stuff with them the whole way? Picking venues with public transport options, it isn't always possible, but stewards can play a role in encouraging or even coordinating ride sharing. Where there's limited close parking, some spaces could be designated as disability spots. Or if all the parking is far away from the main activities, maybe you can set up an unloading zone where people can drop off their things before going to park the car. Also built into your venue are your bathrooms, unless you're using portaloos. Those are not built into your venue. Everyone needs to use the bathroom, but for some people at some events, they simply can't. When picking a venue, pay attention. How many cubicles are there? How big are they? Is a large person going to have to squeeze to get the door open and shut? Is a person with a walker going to be able to get into the cubicle? What about a parent helping their child use the toilet? Are they able to use the bathroom? Obviously, it's good to have wheelchair accessible bathrooms. You want to communicate if you do have those and if you don't have those. But even when you aren't thinking about people with wheelchairs, bathrooms matter and you've got to consider them. When you're laying out your site, please also be aware of how far people are going to go to get to the bathrooms from the activities. A short walk for you can be a longer walk for someone else, and it might even demand recovery time afterwards, turning a quick trip to the bathroom from a 5-minute to a 20-minute interruption in the event. Now, it might seem odd to put climate on the list of things stewards can do. We cannot control the weather, but we can control shelter from the weather. If you're planning an event that might be impacted by very high or very low temperatures or humidity, or it might get rained on, you need to provide shelter from that. At minimum, shade, but for more intense conditions, somewhere with some sort of cooling or heating system, you can think about strategies to help people cope with the temperature, like serving hot or cold beverages or having cold, wet cloths available. And you should also think about bad weather contingency plans. Are there weather conditions that would mean you need to change the activities, to move indoors, to even cancel the event? Work out what the thresholds are that are going to trigger those changes, what you're going to do when you hit those thresholds, and then communicate about that with your attendees. Help was surprisingly low on the list of things people mentioned. It got mentioned a lot less than I expected. People in the survey really appreciated the culture of helpfulness we have in the SCA, but what a number of people mentioned was having a specific person to ask. Who on the stewarding team should people contact if they need accommodations or assistance? Work it out, put the information out there. You should also, by the way, mention who newcomers can contact for advice. I remember one person who wrote that they didn't know whether it was acceptable to use diapers at SCA events. And of course that's acceptable. Of course that's fine. But somehow they didn't know. We didn't communicate it to them. Make it easy for people to find the answers to their questions. I also want to point out in this area that when people talked about help, they were often talking about a particular kind of help. People need help with setup and pack up. Unloading a vehicle, carrying your gear to wherever it goes, setting it up, it's physically demanding for everybody. But for some people, it's not just demanding, it's exhausting and painful. So if anyone here feels like running a trial of something at a large event, maybe this is a new kind of volunteer we could call for. It's certainly something we can think about. Finally, children's spaces and activities. This was pretty much only mentioned by parents, but it was mentioned by almost all parents. So if you want families to be able to attend your events, it's something to keep in mind. Obviously, parents preferred to have activities for children, but even when there aren't specifically kids' activities, there are things that can help. Is there somewhere safe for children to play? Somewhere where parents can look away from their child and have a conversation and know their kid isn't going to run into traffic or the list field or the archery range while they aren't paying attention? And looping back around to information, as I have done several times, does the schedule make it clear which activities children are welcome in and which ones they're expected to stay out of? Okay. So we've just covered a lot of information in a pretty short period of time. Here's where I remind you that this is an overview, and that whole section that I just did is covered by the Steward's Guide on the project website. I also want to be very clear that this list of issues is not a checklist for an accessible event, because a perfectly accessible event isn't possible. There will always be conflicting needs, and stewards will always have to balance those. Just like they already do when they decide between the cheap venue or the one with the better kitchen, the one an hour's drive away or the smaller one in the city. Stewards always balance different considerations depending on the type of event they're trying to run and the people they're trying to run it for. This list is simply a bunch of additional factors to take into account when making those decisions. Really, at the end of the day, there are three things I want you to take away from this presentation. Investigating a problem helps you design good solutions. We only ever have a certain amount of time, of money, of resources. We need to decide where to spend our efforts, and we need to make that decision thoughtfully and well. As tempting as the obvious solution might be, look before you leap. What exactly are you trying to fix? Information empowers everyone. Without changing anything else, without disadvantaging anyone else, you can make events and activities more accessible and inclusive just by providing information about them in advance. We have the tools we need to make change today. We don't need to wait for hearts and minds to change our own practices. And we don't have to wait for them to create change in our group practices either. Social change is important, but practical change matters too, and we can do it now. So go out and do it. And here, as promised, are the links to the project website and to the project Facebook page where you can contact me. I highly encourage you to look at the resources there. I will eventually keep adding stuff as I continue to work through the results. And I really encourage you to reach out if you have questions about the project, about the results, or how to do something similar. And on that note, it's time for questions. I'm going to stop sharing my screen. And because we are being live streamed, and if you don't want your question recorded, you can feel free to put it in the chat. I'll answer from the Facebook page or by email. So let me just end this presentation, and I'd love to hear what you'd like to know.
Would you like me to read some of the stuff in the chat that came up?
Yeah, of course.
Okay, and unless people raise their hands. Purnell from Volunteers said, is there a paved walkway, or is it a smooth park lawn, or is it just a farm field that has been mowed?
Yeah, absolutely. So Often we tend to prioritize, like when we're evaluating a list field, we'll often have the marshal will go out and look for all the potholes and figure out if it's a safe place to be for fighters. You want to do that same kind of evaluation on your paths. Paved paths are obviously going to work the best for folks, but if you can get somewhere that's smooth and level, try and use that for paths. And particularly if there's any hazards on the ground, if there's any potholes or anything, you want to make sure that's visible. Use markers. One person talked about an event where the whole field had been mowed and then they just left all of the grass on the field so nobody could see where any of the potholes were, and they genuinely were at real risk of injuring themselves on that site.
Luca from Port Oasis Ethelmark said, don't forget some sites are primarily used for kids' summer camps and some of the toilets in the cabins are sized for kindergartners. And Kahinda added, yeah, our local event is on a summer camp and one of the restrooms only has enough leg room for a 5-year-old. So we started incorporating porta-johns for that.
Yeah, and that's a really good example of how you can work with the limitations of a site. You know, if you're doing a massive camping event outdoors, you're not going to have paved paths everywhere. You might be doing a site at a kid's summer camp venue and the bathrooms might be small. You can still work with those sites. You can come up with solutions. You need to decide whether that's something you want to invest in, and how you're going to go about doing that. And it's people can be really, really creative with this stuff. For example, one of the things that got mentioned as just a issue that one or two people mentioned, they were talking about how in court it can be hard to hear people. And of course, there's wonderful work people are doing with sign heraldry for that. But somebody mentioned that their group actually has physical signs that they hold up with the symbols for different awards on them. And that struck me as something that was incredibly creative and potentially really valuable, because it doesn't just help people who are sign language users, it also helps everybody else. When we looked at the people in this survey who had sensory issues, some of them were, hard of hearing or deaf or had low vision. Some of them had sensory processing issues. And if they don't know sign language, they're still going to be stuck trying to hear what's going on.
Thora Brand's daughter said, thank you for compiling all this. As a mobility disability person myself, I'd like to encourage any stewards to not be afraid to ask folks how they can change it to be more inclusive. Giving space where I feel welcome to ask for assistance instead of feeling like I'm a burden is super helpful.
Yeah, absolutely. So asking is good. Involving people who have access needs is a really great way to make sure that you are considering those access needs, and particularly with stuff like wheelchair accessible bathrooms. If you're not a wheelchair user, it's really easy to miss some of the key features that make it actually wheelchair accessible. So do reach out, and often people will have more creative solutions than you will have necessarily thought of, because they're used to navigating this issue.
Also follow up for that, Kathleen said, I'm an event venue owner. Where is the best location for the accessible restroom? In a central location or near the handicap parking and camping areas?
That's such a good question, because the answer is kind of both. So you want to be thinking about, okay, where are people going to be spending their time, and if they're spending most of their day in that central area, then having an accessible restroom there, that's really valuable. But people need to use the bathroom at the end of the day as well, or in the middle of the night as well. So having something near the camping areas is also valuable. If you can only have one of those two places, maybe somewhere that's a compromise between them, that's partway between them, so that instead of people having to go a 15-minute trip during the day and a 2-minute trip at night, that they're spending sort of 7 minutes both times of day. This is one of those things where you sort of hit conflicting access needs, different solutions for different problems.
There's two more comments. Thora said, goodness, if I had $1 for every quote unquote accessible restroom that I couldn't actually get the door closed around my chair. And Amanda said, quote, it'll fit your chair through, but not your hands on wheels doorways are another classic.
Absolutely. So one of the things I actually have in my venue sort of accessibility evaluation thing, it's basically a template that you can use to give a brief overview of what the venue's like to folks when you're trying to describe your venue, is narrow corridors less than 3 feet across. And I picked 3 feet because that was going to be about wide enough for most folks' wheelchairs and their hands. You do actually need enough room to get through the door. And we often don't think of it. And feast halls in particular, it's really tempting to fit everybody in as much as you can. But once people are actually sitting down, their chairs back onto each other, and you end up with these tiny little gaps that even, people without any mobility aids can certainly struggle in getting through.
That's all from the chat right now. Oh, wait, there's another one. I'm so thankful to see transportation challenges included in there. I would love to be more involved, but I can't drive and my partner isn't always available to take us to events, or it might not be something he's comfortable attending yet because of his autism.
Absolutely. And actually that's really one significant thing, is that transport challenges has a big overlap with financial stuff, but it has an overlap with other things as well. And interestingly, there were a few people who, when I asked, what factors affect your experience that don't affect other members of your community, there are a number of people who mentioned, I have a partner outside the SCA. And it does actually shape your experience and what's possible. There were folks who talked about how I used to be able to get to events, but now the friends I used to travel with have moved away. There were also people who talked about stuff like, oh, I moved house and now I'm so much further away from everything that happens, or I moved to a different group and it's way more spread out. Getting to events can be a really significant hurdle. And it's not something we tend to think of as an accessibility issue, but it actually really is. And it really is an inclusion issue. It really does affect, particularly, I noticed, like, when I looked at when I compared the demographics of the folks who'd mentioned transport issues and age, there's this lovely little curve where young folk who are, just hitting university often don't have a car or can't drive, and elderly folk are, as people get older, they're more likely to have difficulty driving, and particularly driving long distances. So any support that you can offer to help people get to your events, and if people are likely to have to come a long way, thinking as well about stuff like, is there billeting options, are there places where they can couch surf? That can also help with people who might have to travel long distances to get to an event.
Pernell says, thank you for the survey. Luca says, transportation affects my shire. And Mael from Montier said, being on an island, getting off it is expensive, so we have a local culture of ride sharing.
Yeah, and it's really something where group practices can evolve. I mean, this is a space where if your group wanted to have an officer whose job was to help coordinate ride sharing, that's something that would probably be feasible because it can be complex. But, in different, for different events, it's going to function out, it's going to pan out in different ways. I know there's a major event here in Lockhart, which is on a camping site that is not too far from a regional train station, but far enough you definitely need a vehicle to get from the train station to site. So every year there's sort of a shuttle service just doing trips from the station to site to help link up some of those folks. So that is one of those examples of something where the group as a whole can think about a range of different practices to make it work better.
That's all in the chat right now.
Fantastic. So while I've got you, I might just boast a little bit. about sort of some of the process of this survey, so you've got a bit more context for where these results are coming from. So this was a online survey. It was distributed mostly through Facebook, and it started off, I was sharing it in a lot of LOCAC spaces, and then I shared it in a few sort of DEI Facebook groups, and then it got shared further from there. 2/3 of people told me their kingdom, and half of those were from LOCAC. The rest could be from anywhere. What I found, though, was that when I looked at the results, we got a similar distribution of time in the SCA and of age as what was in the SCA 2020 census. So I think it's approximately similar in distribution to the kinds of people who already fill out online surveys. But that does mean that you are missing out on people who don't fill out online surveys. So this survey is inevitably going to miss folks who, for example, aren't confident English speakers. They aren't part of this because they probably wouldn't have picked up on the survey. People who don't use the internet a lot and don't use social media, they probably would have been left out. And I think that's one thing that's really important to consider when you're looking at results from research projects like this is, okay, but where did the data come from? How was it collected? And how is that going to bias what we get in the results?
Laura is asking, only if you'd like to answer, if you were to run the survey again, what changes would you make? Any areas you'd like to focus on more?
That is a very good question. It would get completely different results now because of COVID, because we all had we've experienced different kinds of things now. I think now that I have some topics that I know are likely to emerge, I would probably make a bit more use of some multiple choice questions. I honestly would be really fascinated to dig more into the data about different kinds of events and different kinds of activities and find out more about, what makes those more or less accessible, because that really wasn't something that I was initially planning to dig into, but then I had like the beginnings of an answer to that question. I think the big change I would want to make, honestly, is because of the way the survey was originally framed and where it was shared, I think that encouraged people to think about health issues. And so we got a lot of accessibility type stuff around health and lifestyle. We got less inclusion stuff. And so, a fairly small number of people mentioned ethnicity, religion, race, culture, that whole group. I don't know if that's because a small number of people of, experiencing those inclusion issues answered my survey, or if they just didn't think to mention it. Maybe, maybe a third of people in my survey were Black. I don't know. But it looks like I don't know anything about the experiences of ethnically, religiously, culturally, and racially diverse folks. I'd like to know more about that. And honestly, it's probably worth asking about gender for some of that attitude stuff. There were mentions in the sort of cultural stuff, there were mentions of sort of sexism and things like that. But also things like around some of the combat stuff, there are a couple of mentions of people talking about how they couldn't find loaner equipment for their size or their shape, or that everybody teaching in the group are these huge blokes, and for them it meant that the training it was harder for them to get into doing those activities. So I kind of feel like there's scope for more learning about those identity and inclusion and things. On the other hand, dealing with the cultural and attitudinal stuff is intimidating as hell for me. I am massively impressed by the bravery of everyone who wades into the great swamp of trying to persuade people to change their minds and their attitudes. And I suspect if I started asking a lot more questions about inclusion of uh, diverse cultures and genders and sexualities and all those kind of things, I would end up with a lot more of that result. And I don't know if I'd be game to actually work with it. So thank you for the question.
Just a time check. There's 13 minutes left.
All right, fantastic. So I'll probably wrap up in a minute. Again, you are very welcome to reach out via the Facebook page if you think of any questions that you'd like to ask. And that goes out to everybody currently watching the live stream or who watches this video later. I'm very happy to chat about this. I'm excited about this project. I spent a whole lot of effort in trying to um, analyze the enormous amount of data everyone gave me. And if anybody watching this happened to fill out my survey, thank you so much. I was absolutely delighted by the response that I got from everybody. Surveys like this only work when people give us data. And I really appreciate you taking the time to share your thoughts and your experiences, the good, the bad, and the ugly, so that we can try and learn from them. On that note, I'm going to wrap up so that everybody has a chance to, if you're going to any other sessions, I know we're almost done for the day, you can take a break, get a drink of water, and otherwise you can have an early mark and go to bed if you're in the European time zone. I know it's pretty late over there. But again, thanks for your time. Thanks for your interest. I hope that this gives you some ideas for things that you can do in future and that you can encourage in your group. DEIB is a huge space, but I think there's really room for some practical policies affecting the way we do things around here. And I think that this survey is one example of how we can figure out what those policies should be. Thank you all.
Thank you so much. I'll stop recording now.